Thank you, Steve. Thanks, Jeff, for being so able in setting all this up. Thank you to everybody who is here with us this evening. Steve mentioned that the origin of this webinar was, in a sense, an expression of gratitude to people who helped fund our ELL program, and so I express gratitude to them as well. And I also feel gratitude to the people who are here from Texas and Florida, who as Steve said, it was exactly accurate. It was out of a conversation and feeling like it's just not enough to send good vibes. Like we have to actually do something to try and offer what we have. And it isn't that hard to see the connection between what we are deeply involved with of Mussar study and practice, and also the difficult situations that people are facing in Texas and Florida. And I express gratitude to you for attending, for doing something for yourself. That in itself is something that I'm grateful for. But I also hope that if there's something here that's of value, that you will take it and give it to other people. And I'll be grateful to you for that as well, because it's very central to our thinking that Mussar is our heritage. It doesn't belong to any particular individual or any particular organization or any limitation. It is the heritage of the Jewish people. And that turns out to be directly relevant to what we're going on to look at this evening, because I'm really going to focus more on the people who are facing the current difficulties that we're well aware of. And if we had more supporters in Puerto Rico, where I don't know if we have anybody in Puerto Rico involved in our work, but there and Barbuda and St. Martin and so on, people are really facing great difficulty right now. And I personally have not had that experience of going through a hurricane and the extreme challenge that it presents, and then the equal challenge, if not greater challenge, of cleaning up and rebuilding afterward. But we know that this is not a unique occurrence in world history and in Jewish history. And we are people with a very long memory. And so for us, the notion of dealing with flooding goes back a really long way. And, it's sort of one of the foundation stories of the Bible is the story of the flood. And, in that case, what Noah was facing and his generation faced was not just a flood. I mean, the flood was the vehicle, but it was really the destruction of the entire world and everything that lived on it. So as a starting point, it's sometimes good to remember that somebody had it worse than us. That's its own technique for being resilient. But it's just also an indication or an index that we can look back into Jewish history and find lessons that have direct application to what we ourselves are experiencing in our generation, our personal lives. But really, although it was inevitable that I would refer to Noah when we're talking about the flooding of the hurricanes, it's not really Noah that I want to draw on to start looking for the lessons in our tradition for what we can do and how we can learn from the past to apply to the present. It's actually Abraham. Now, Abraham lived 400 years after Noah, which in some ways is not very long when you consider what the world was like in Noah's time, but then by the time Abraham came along, we learned that it's 400 years. And when the commentators look over the whole history of Abraham in the Torah, what they parse out or they filter out, distill out, is the fact that you can see that in Abraham's life, there were 10 tests. And Jeff, you go on to the next slide. The Hebrew word for test or trial in this case is nisayon. It's interesting, in modern Hebrew, the word nisayon means test or trial, except if it's in the plural. In the Mussar world, if you give the plural of nisayon, it means tests, like singular test, plural test. In modern Hebrew, singular, test, plural, experience. So when you're in a job interview and people say, what's your nisyonot? They want to know what are your experiences that you bring to the job. But in a Jewish spiritual context, this is referring to tests or trials that come in life. And the commentators tell us that Abraham faced 10 distinct tests. And the word nisayon, it shows up directly in the Torah itself, because God says to Abraham, or it's written there, it says, and then God says, Vayhi achrei hadvarim ha'ele, Elohim nisa, from the same root as nisayon, nisa et Avraham, vayomer alav Avraham. So, and it was after these things that God tested Abraham, nisa et Avraham, and God said, Avraham. And Avraham replied, vayomer hineni, I am here. So right in the Torah, we learn this notion that Abraham is being tested. And when we go on to the next slide, you'll see that the tests that Abraham faced, well, there's that quote in English, that God tested Abraham and God said, here am I. Go on, Jeff. And here are the 10 tests that the commentators say Abraham faced. Of course, being Jewish Torah scholarship, not everybody agrees on the list of 10. Everybody agrees there are 10. Some put different things in, but it starts out with being thrown into a furnace because of Abraham's belief in a single God, the monotheistic innovation that Abraham made, which led to that. And it goes right down through his marriages, his issues with Pharaoh and Avimelech, and right down to the binding of Isaac and the challenge that God throws, which is one which preoccupies commentators in the Jewish world, which is what's this one about? But clearly it's a test of Abraham in some form. And so Abraham was tested in 10 different ways. And in this, Abraham is not unique. Abraham just presents the paradigm, and it's a way of looking at life that circumstances happen which test us. Now, obviously, dealing with a hurricane is a circumstance like that. Losing a job, a diagnosis, an illness, trouble in a marriage, trouble in a relationship. Abraham got tested 10 times. I think many of us feels like, and what did he do on Tuesday? In other words, like our lives are so challenging that there are tests all the time. And in fact, go on to the next slide, please, Jeff. In this book, Mesilat Yesharim, The Path of the Just by Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, and you'll notice we're moving up a little bit in time. This is early 18th century. So Mesilat Yesharim is one of the fundamental texts of the Mussar world, and later I'll draw on the other of the two fundamental texts. This is one of the fundamental texts. And Ramchal, as he's known, says, and Jeff, go on to the next slide. This is a quote from the chapter 1 of this classic book, which was published in Amsterdam in 1740. So it's coming up on its 300th anniversary. And Ramchal says, humanity is truly placed in the midst of a raging battlefield. For all matters of this world, whether for the good or for the bad, are trials. And I put up the Hebrew so that if you can read Hebrew, you'll see that he says nisyonot. He actually says that. And if I had more sophistication in a webinar, I'd have some kind of laser that would point out the word, but take it from me. And he says, whether for the good or the bad are trials for a person. Poverty on one side versus wealth on the other. Tranquility on one hand versus suffering on the other, until the battle is waged against him from the front and from the rear. So it's a very interesting perspective on the ups and downs of life, because whether it's an up or whether it's a down, he sees it as being a trial. a challenge, a test. And it's not hard to see how that works. It's easy to see it in regard to things that happen that we might easily categorize as negative. In other words, I got an email today from somebody who's been very involved in our Mussar activities from Houston, and it included a photo of her house under about 6 feet of water. Not hard to see how that's a test and a trial. She's had to find a place to live. Her elderly mother lives with her. This is a real test. It's a little more difficult to see how the good presents us with a test, but it does. And he's entirely right about that. If, for example, you have a luxurious house, you have a very comfortable house, the challenge is, in that case, perhaps, how hospitable are you to other people? How much do you think that house is your private castle, or how much do you adhere to the commandment to practice hachnasat orchim, to welcome guests? That can be a test. Having something can be a test. Similarly with wealth and poverty. Not hard to see how poverty is a test, but wealth is just as much a test in a different way, to see how does one use their wealth? How do you behave in the community? How generous? How much charity and tzedakah do you do? And so on. And he just brings a few examples. The other one he brings here is tranquility on the one hand and suffering on the other. Suffering is clearly a test. Suffering is such an obvious trial. But tranquility is its own test, because in the face of tranquility, a person can become completely inert, passive, inactive. That's not how we're supposed to live. So it can be very challenging to be self-motivating, self-guiding, and self-disciplined in the face of a life which has no real external difficulties. And I know many people are surprised by how challenging, for example, retirement can be. You have everything worked out. You have enough resources, you have time, you have peace, you have health, you have everything, and that's like, and the people are shaking. It's like going into withdrawal. I don't think I need to believe, oh, who did that? That must be Jeff. It's not a laser, but notice the little miraculous hand from heaven that circled the word nisyonot that I was referring to. That's very good. This kind of webinar demands a partnership, because I can't advance the slides and I can't do the little doodads that Jeff is able to do. But there, if you can read Hebrew, you'll see the word nisyonot. The idea of life is challenging. Life is full of challenges. This was 300 years ago. Abraham was 3,000 years ago, more than that. And it has never been different. And the challenges can be the difficulties in life, and the challenges can be what we see as good things in life. And I've often thought about, I once did a talk, where was I? Phoenix. And I was talking to a group of high school students, and somehow I got on the topic of success. And I was saying it's harder sometimes to contend with success than it is with failure, for the very reason that failure presents its tests, obviously. Whereas success, sometimes you have to be very disciplined to see that it is also a test, and you're being tested by the reality and the choices that it puts in front of you. What are you saying here? Oh. Go on to the next slide, Jeff. I'm not sure what it is, but let me see. Okay, no, we'll just hold that one. And you can, while I talk about what I'm going to say, you can remove the little halo. There are two perspectives we can bring on what the Ramchal teaches about life being full of challenges, or as he puts it, that people are situated in a battlefield before them and behind them. The most obvious perspective on that is that you're here to pass and fail tests, because that's the nature of tests. That's how we think about tests in general. You're being presented with a challenge you could pass. If you do well, if you answer right, you're going to pass. And if you come up with the wrong answer, you're going to fail. And that kind of perspective is, I think, a very crude perspective and not really a Mussar perspective, because we're not interested in failing tests. We're not interested in having people stand up and get knocked down by life experience. That's just not what we're about. And there is another perspective on the notion of tests that I wanted to present today. And you understand, this is right in line with this whole theme of resilience, because here's a perspective on how to understand the test from a Jewish perspective. The root of the word nisayon can be seen to come from the word nes. Obviously, nun samach is this common two letters in there. And nes, in one meaning, is a miracle. That's not what we're talking about here. The other meaning of the word nes is as a flag or a banner, you know, something that you raise up. And there's lots of uses of that in the tradition. And if we retranslate the verse from the Torah in this way, the conventional translation is God tested Abraham. But when you realize that the word nes means a flag that you raise up, you can translate the verse as to say, God raised Abraham up. And as he would raise, or as anyone would raise, a banner. And the Ramban, who was Nachmanides, who was the 13th century great mystical kind of interpreter of the Torah, he said that a nisayon, a test, is not meant to see if a person is able to withstand the test or not. That's not what a test is about, because it's a principle of Jewish thought that we're never given a test that we don't have the capacity or the tools to withstand. We can stand this test. Rather, life is set up in its fundamental structure to give us many tests, because this is the life process through which we become strengthened and more resourced so that we can rise up to the higher level of greatness that is our potential. And this concept fits very much with what Ramchal taught in, and I just quoted, in Mesilat Yesharim, that life delivers us a constant stream of challenges. Some are large, some are small. Some we perceive as positive, some we perceive as negative. There's just a constant set of opportunities to lift ourselves up and make ourselves greater and bring ourselves closer to our human potential. So I want you to see that right within the word nisayon, the Hebrew word for tests or trials, there is a sense of elevation. And this becomes an important perspective because it gives us a lens through which to see that this is not about the cruelty of life and that first perspective of pass, fail. This is about a process of becoming, in which these cauldrons we find ourselves in are just the vessels through which we get well cooked and we become more seasoned and we become more prepared. And I'm mixing my metaphors between rising up and cooking, but to return to the original metaphor, it really is the method through which we become elevated. And that's really so much of what Mussar is about. The quote or the title on your screen right now is from, as it says, the Altar of Navardik. But there's another one of the altars, the three leaders of the Mussar movement, who said at one point, he said, don't be better, be higher. And there's a whole sense of being b'nei aliyah, to be people who want to rise up. And this perspective, which is very deeply seated in the Mussar world, applies here because this is a very fundamental perspective on nisyanot. Let's look at how that works in particular. So I brought a text here from the Altar of Navardik, Rabbi Yosef Yotzel Horowitz, and he lived at the end of the 19th into the early 20th century, died in 1919. And he wrote a book called Madregas HaAdam, The Levels of Humanity. And in it there is a section which this is taken from. And he's asking a question there. He's asking about, the question he's addressing in this 9th chapter of this section is about whether a person's spiritual life is diminished by community service. And he's addressing a different question, but you'll see how that fits with our need here. His question is, people say, I'm spiritual, so I don't get involved in politics. I'm spiritual, so I don't go on the board of the synagogue. I'm just interested in the spiritual life. And he wants to take that on because he says that from a Mussar perspective, spirituality demands activism. And he brings an example of a story, the story of Rob Preto, which is a Talmudic story. And the story as it's told here, and you've got the quote on your screen, was that he had a student who he had to teach the story. You don't have the full story here. He had to teach the lesson to this student 400 times before the student got it. Every lesson had to be taught 400 times for this student to get it. And someone once pointed out to me, this was clearly a Talmudic story about a special needs student, because this was an extraordinary amount of demand on the teacher. But it happened one time that during the lesson, somebody came in, stuck their head into the room and said, after you're finished, Rav Preto, there's a mitzvah you have to go do. And then the person left. And so Rav Preto went back to teaching the student. He taught him the same lesson 400 times. And at the end of the 400 times, he said to him, okay, did you get the lesson? And the student said, no, I didn't get it. And Rob Preto said, why? What happened? He said, the student said, as soon as that person put his head into the office and said you had to go for a mitzvah, I stopped paying attention because I kept thinking, the teacher's going to leave now. The teacher's going to leave now. The teacher's about to leave. So he was only focused on the teacher leaving, and he stopped paying attention to the lesson. He didn't get it. So, and that's where this story gets picked up at the altar of Navardik. He says, his pupil placed a demand of 800 repetitions upon his patients, because that's how Rav Preto responded. When the student said he couldn't concentrate, Rav Preto said, okay, I'm staying. We're going to do this 400 more times until you get it. So the Talmudic story is that he taught him the lesson 800 times. His pupil placed a demand of 800 repetitions upon his patients, and he was therefore certain that he must exercise patience to that extent. Not so with one who relies exclusively on his own judgment. He's incapable of exacting such forbearance from himself. So you see that in the context of what the altar of Navardik is talking about, he's saying that community service puts you through situations that test you and cause you to develop inner qualities that you would never assign to yourself. You'd never put yourself through whatever it is that the test is giving to you. You would not give yourself the same test. No one's going to give themselves a test of putting their house 6 feet underwater. No teacher is going to give themselves a test of teaching the same lesson to one student 800 times. And that's the altar's point, that nobody would give themselves. He says, how does he put it? Not so with one who relies exclusively on his own judgment. I'm guiding my spiritual life and practice, and I'm going to create a situation of calm and tranquility and isolation so I can be more spiritual and I can get into contact with God. And he's saying, are you kidding? It takes these challenges, these nisyanot, and clearly a student like this is a challenge, that's what forms a person. That's what creates a Rav Preto. And he says that later on. He says, I didn't bring that, but in the actual text, he says, and this is how he became Rav Preto, was because of putting himself into the situation and being tested. And just to make this a bit contemporary, I was looking in for more contemporary spiritual sources to back this up. And I found something in that great spiritual source, Forbes magazine. Because there's an article recently in Forbes magazine, in the last month, about how people rose up, and that's the other interpretation of Nisyanot, how people rose up to meet the challenges of Hurricane Harvey. It was interesting that that was what was being written about in Forbes magazine. And the article mentions a woman named Nicole Richard, for example, who stopped at her local gas station. And when she was there, she found a family friend who was stranded by the storm. And within a very short time, Nicole had 15 guests and 7 dogs staying at her house for food and shelter. And so she never, according to the altar of Novardok, she never would have tested herself. I'm not sure that the slideshow has not been aborted. I mean, this was not the slide I'm seeing was not one of the ones I put into the slideshow. I'm seeing a picture of Steve right now. So Jeff, if there's something else, please, you can put that up. Not that I mind seeing a picture of Steve. So there is a mitzvah, as I mentioned earlier, of hachnasat orchim, which is welcoming guests. And I said that a person who has an abundant house, a large residence, could see themselves being tested by hospitality. Well, here's a woman who rose up and she made her house available to 15 people and 7 dogs. And there's another story in that same article about Kari Saratovsky, who, along with her husband, as soon as the floods happened, she's in Houston, she started out by going to Home Depot and spending $600 of her own money on building materials. And then her daughter gave her the idea of starting a funding program, who knows, maybe Go Fund It or something. But she ended up working with the Houston JCC, and they ended up raising $60,000. And this was just her own initiative. In other words, she started out, of course, that draws people into it. It's not that you end up doing something necessarily single-handedly, but she ended up, raising $60,000 to help people with the flood. And so I think you see these people were in the situation. They were in the place. They weren't like in, Omaha, and then they said, well, let's do something for these poor people. They were faced with the challenge, and how they responded in the challenge ended up lifting themselves as they lifted other people. Now, I don't know if the slideshow is still happening because I'm still seeing Steve's face, but why don't someone put into chat if you can see the slide. Ah, good. Okay, perfect. Now go to the next one. Okay, so we'll go on now to draw a source from Duties of the Heart, which is the other fundamental Mussar text. And here we're going to get more specific, because it isn't just that the tests are opportunities to rise up. That's true. In a general sense, it's true. But for each individual, the challenge of the situation is likely to trigger different inner traits which have the capacity to grow in that person. So, for example, I mentioned that woman who took all those guests into her house. Maybe that was normal for her. I mean, maybe she was just a very hospitable person, and that situation was not such a challenge for her. But within the overall situation, maybe something else was a challenge. So each person gets challenged in a way which is reflective of the makeup of their own inner life. So the stingy person is challenged by being asked to give, or the person who makes a religious practice of 8.5 hours of sleep every night is challenged when displaced. Or, somebody who is on their cell phone day and night, they're asked by the police to keep the line free, and they have to withdraw and restrain themselves. Everybody's challenge is the one or the multiple that specifically reflect their own inner challenge. There's a matchup between the inner and the outer. And I want to focus now on two traits which are very germane to that. Now, people will be challenged by all kinds of things, but these two tend to be ones which are perhaps the most general and are very crucial to responding to a challenge with resilience, because that's how you rise up, to enter into the challenge, or as my Mussar teacher says, to lean into life, not to be pushed back. So go to the next slide, please, Jeff. He's talking here about humility. And humility is very central to most people's response to the kinds of challenges and tests we're talking about right now. Because as the quote begins, if a person is humble, he attaches no special importance to himself. Well, if you flip that around, in most cases, people attach a great deal of importance to themselves. Now, some people are more humble, and so it's less, as he says here. But in our world, which is so ego-driven and so egotistical, I've often pointed out that it took our generation to come up with magazines called Self and Us. And, you know, it's as if someone had a magazine called Me, which I don't know if it exists, but I wouldn't be surprised if it did. There is a very strong focus on the individual, so much so that politics now has become, you know, what people call identity politics. It's not about policies. It's not about fitness to lead. It's about identity. It's about ego. And that's not the Jewish way. The Jewish way stresses humility. And so here's a teaching from Chovat HaLevavot, Duties of the Heart, the Gate of Humility, chapter 10. If a person is humble, he attaches no special importance to himself. So whatever he attains of the world suffices him for his sustenance and other needs. This gives him peace of mind and diminishes anxiety. Think resilience. That's my insert. He eats what is available, wears what he finds, sleeps where he can, and is content with very few worldly goods because of his humility. The humble person is patient when misfortune strikes him and when he suffers reversals in his affairs. So it's interesting, because I think what you could say, if I edited out from this all the references to humility, you could interpret all of these descriptions as absolutely describing resilience. A person who is satisfied with what he has, wears whatever is available, sleeps where there is a bed available, patient when misfortune strikes, and so on. So because of that, because you can see that there is a kind of correspondence between this description and resilience, the fact that Ibn Battuta brings in humility teaches us something very fundamental about responding to difficulty, which is that disruption in life is a test, and a key quality that permits a person to maximize the growth through that test is not to be saying, you know, poor me, or why is this happening to me, or whatever it is with an I perspective. In other words, this is all about me and this is my ego being disrupted. Instead of that, it's for a person to respond as Abraham responded, and that's that concept of hineni. I'm here. I'm here. And I don't know if I made a slide of this or not. Go to the next one, Jeff, and let's see if I did or not. I'm trying to think if I made a slide of this, and if not, oh, no, I didn't. Okay, so go back. What I was going to point out is that Rabbi Avraham Yitzchak Kook, who was the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Israel, and he died in 1935 or 36, I believe. He gave 11 teachings on humility in his writings, and the first of his teachings on humility is that hineni suggests humility. He says, the person who can respond to, like Abraham did, to say, I'm here, I'm ready, I'm present, hineni, I'm here, that shows humility. Because instead of saying, as I was saying earlier, why me? Why is this happening to me? I don't deserve this. This isn't fair, etc. In other words, getting into a sense of the evaluation of the challenge. What Abraham teaches us, and Rabbi Cook points out, is that a simple statement of your presence and readiness shows humility. And turn that around. It takes humility to not see what's going on through the lens of ego. And so to be able to be present to the challenge, to be clear and transparent and responsive to the challenge, so that all that ego stuff is not getting in the way. So that's one key and historic lesson. So Bahi ibn Bakuda, who's the quote is from, lived in the 11th century, and Rav Kook lived in the 20th century. And both of them are telling us that one of the keys to being resilient and to turning challenges into opportunities to lift up is the quality of humility. If you go to the next slide now, Jeff, which now I know what it is because you showed it to me already. Somehow this heading got a little bit turned around, which happens sometimes when I've got English and Hebrew on the same line. But it is bitachon, and the spelling of the Hebrew is correct too. This is the quality of trust. I said I'd only bring two qualities, and these are the two I really want to offer to you, to think in terms of humility, and therefore being present, being able to say, hineni, I'm here in the face of the challenge. And the other one that we learned, again, from Bahi ibn Bakuda, from the same text, 11th century, Duties of the Heart, he says that trust, and in the Mussar sense, bitachon is really trusting God. So to have a sense of trusting God, he says, and look how similar these will be to what we learned about humility. Among the benefits of trusting God in this world are the following: a heart at rest, free of worldly cares, a tranquil spirit undisturbed and untroubled by lack of bodily gratification. Think again in terms of challenges. Think about being displaced by a hurricane. A sense of calm, security, and peace. As it says, blessed is the person who trusts in God. God will be this person's refuge. He is like a tree planted by water that sends out its roots by the stream. So this is also from that same text. The tests we face when life flies upside down call on us to accept the situation that's at hand, to say hineni, and then to recognize, that's where humility comes in. This is not all about me, but not only that, I'm not in control. I'm really not in control. It's obvious in a situation where the wind is blowing at 180 miles an hour, no one can stop the wind. No one can stop the rain. These are obviously things that are beyond the control of an individual. But if you even expand the picture larger, and this is where it is, bitachon is one of the fundamental qualities in Mussar teaching. None of us created ourselves. None of us wrote the script of our lives. No one here determined who their parents were, what house they grew up in, what the socioeconomic status of that house was, what neighborhood they grew up in. We didn't write the script, and we certainly did not direct the play. And most importantly, for all of us, we don't know what's coming next. We never know. If I had more time, I'd tell you there's some good Jewish jokes about people who really make it clear that they don't know what's coming next. We don't know what's coming next. The next moment is a surprise. And we've all had experiences where we thought it was going one way and suddenly it went another direction. And that's the way life is. Each of us is called up to humbly do our part, and the Mussar teachers say to trust that the long and colorful cavalcade of life that you have entered, not at the beginning, and that you will leave, not at the end, is meaningful and purposeful. Even if in a single moment, and from the vantage point of a single life, we can't see the meaning and the purpose in the big picture. And this is so clear to me in terms of my own life, where I'm about to be 68 years old. Things that happened which seemed at the time to be one thing turned out to be another. Things that seemed to be blessings turned out to be curses. Things that be curses turned out to be blessings. In the short term, the story looks one way. When you lengthen the time frame, it can look very different. And we're encouraged by the Mussar teachers to trust in the long-term process, for which the challenges are the momentary tests of this particular situation. But our response to them is part of writing the longer story that they contain. So bitachon, this idea of trust, provides us the foundation for us to endure, because we recognize and lean on our partnership with a higher power, and some would say with an inner power. This is not meant to be theologically specific. In fact, there's many ways to understand bitachon without having a very clear sense at all of what one is relying on. But the idea of the big picture of life being something that we're not in control of, that we're not the writer of the play and not the director of the play. We don't know how it started. We don't know how it's going to end. We're in the play, and we can't see the full picture. We are told that adopting an attitude of trust makes us resilient, gives us the foundation to endure, makes us present. This is part of strengthening one's humility, to be able to say, Hineni, because I can be here. This is really terrible. This is really hard. This is not what I chose. I didn't want this. I never asked for whatever it may be that's my challenge of the moment. But I'm going to be present for it, because I trust that this is part of a longer process that is moving in a direction that our tradition tells us is toward the good. And I'm going to do my part to respond to that. And so if we understand that tests and challenges are opportunities to rise up, and we learned that right in the etymology of the Hebrew word nisayon, which I didn't make up. Ramban is 13th century who pointed this out, that what I wanted to focus on in particular is two traits that almost all of us can use to be more resilient in the face of these challenges. One being humility. And I hope you understand that. I'm going to leave a little bit of time at the end for questions. So if there's anything you want to ask about that, but it makes sense to me. I don't teach things usually that don't make sense to me, but it makes sense to me that getting the ego out of the way or lowered makes one more able to think clearly and be able to be responsive in the situation. And at the same time, this notion of bitachon, of trust, is a way in which you develop the inner quality that allows you to, again, as it says in the quote, have a calm mind, to have a sense of longevity in the situation and the big picture, and to be able to respond. And as the verse says, blessed is the person who trusts in God. It becomes a blessing. you could read that differently. It says blessed is, but maybe blessed is the person. That the person who trusts in God is blessed. That the situation which at the time can seem like a curse, it's this very quality of trusting God and investing that turns it into a blessing. And Jeff, go to the next slide. I want to end with this one. This is from a psalm, and it's a very common one. It's one that many people will be familiar with, because this is the psalm that we recite before Birkat Hamazon, before benching on Shabbat and Yom Tov. So after a Shabbat meal, people who bench first recite this Shir HaMalot, this particular psalm, and towards the end of the psalm, there's this line that says, Hazorim Bedima Barina Yiktzoru. Those who sow in tears will reap in joyful song. Rina, joyful song. I often stumble at this line because I don't want to go through the rest of the song. I want to focus on this one because it has a profound meaning. What is it saying? I mean, again, like all psalms and biblical verses, we can interpret it many different ways. But I want to point out two things. Those who sow in tears. One is in tears. That's the given situation. Something has happened, we don't know what, but the person is distressed. And the sign of the distress is crying. The person is crying. What does the psalm say? Now, we want to be people who harvest in joyful song. We're much more drawn to joy than we are to sadness. We want to harvest, and we want to be joyful in the harvest. And the key that the psalm gives us is to sow, to plant, even while we're still crying. This is a message about non-despair. That if a person sees themselves, and it requires a certain amount of self-awareness, but if the person sees him or herself slipping into a darker place of despair or despondency in the midst of tears, the psalm is saying you need to be active. That the person who is active, the person who plants seeds, even while crying, that person will reap a harvest in joyful song. We're being told to be active in our own cause, to be planters, even at the time of dislocation. And I think those two examples I gave, the two people, one who raised money, one took people into their house, those are just examples of planting seeds. There could be 1,000 interpretations, and there should be a personal interpretation of what seeds you can plant in the face of something which may knock you back. Because the psalm is telling us to sow, to plant seeds, even in times of sorrow, not to be susceptible to the dark hole from which there is no light and there is no positive place to go. I want to point out one more thing here, that the psalm states it in the plural, hazorim, those who sow. It's not about one individual. It's available to all of us. It's in the plural to indicate that it applies to all of us, that the possibility of planting and reaping and being joyful, even when the beginning of the story is sorrow, this is being emphasized as something that is a potential for all of us. Hazorim, the plural. So with that, I just want to wrap this up and leave a few minutes for any questions you might have. And if you have questions, the way to do that is to put them into the chat box.
So thank you, Alan. This is Jeff again. I think there's a couple questions in the question and answer box. I had to log back in, so I lost some of them. I think Efrod had a question. I don't know if you see that.
Yes, I can see it. Do you know the citation of the Ramban explanation of Nisayon? Off the top of my head, I don't, but I probably have my record, so we can email about that. And then Sue asked, that must be Sue Pickens, I'm not sure what that means. It says, if one has a sense of call, where is the urgency to take action? I mean, maybe I answered this question already. Where is the urgency to take action? I think the line from the Psalm to me talks about maybe not urgency, but the importance of being active. You know, I think we have to give place to our emotions too. This is not about running roughshod about what you're feeling. It's about the ability to be active even while having certain kinds of feelings. It doesn't say those who are in tears should stop crying and then plant seeds. It doesn't say that. It says while you're crying, it acknowledges the emotion, be active. Be active for the future. Have trust in the future. You know, imagine that the reason the person's crying is because their crops failed or the rain didn't come, or, you know, from an agricultural point of view, it could take a lot of trust every year to put seeds in the ground. And so I think it's not so much a sense of urgency as it is a sense of the real importance of forward motion, of action on behalf of the future. And in that sense, to plant. Good analogy, I think. Anybody else?
Still have a few moments for some more questions if anyone wants to put those in.
I noticed an earlier question is asking why I was laughing at flooding. My God, I certainly wouldn't. I mean, there must have been some way in which I was saying things or the way things were contextualized that I think you should understand, and I hope you do, that my whole motivation in this is based on sharing the feeling. And as Steve said in the beginning, the whole reason we wanted to do this was to offer what we can to help people and to be shoulder to shoulder emotionally, and to bring forward the teachings of the tradition in the hope that this will be helpful for you. And am I still live, Jeff?
You're still alive.
I'm still alive. See, I'm grateful for that. So I'm just going to sign off by saying Gemar Chatima Tova, that may you be sealed in the book of life for a good year ahead, or a good year that's already started. May this be a good year. You know, Mae West said, I've been rich and I've been poor. Rich is better. In that sense that challenges, I hope that the challenges you face are the challenges of abundance and success and just good things, that good things come your way. And that you have eyes to see that those are challenges too. But, you know, I'm happier wishing you those kinds of challenges.
Alan Suzanne did post a final question there if you have time.
Then we'll sign that.
And I don't know if Steve wants to say anything. If not, then we'll sign off after that.
Oh, I'm looking in chat. I should be looking in Q&A now.
Yes.
Okay. It seems to be very difficult to have a sense of equanimity, bitachon, while slogging through the water. You know, so if you can see her question, it seems to be very difficult to have a sense of equanimity or bitachon while slogging through the water in 90 degrees or more, and a sense of how we will survive. How do you square this with the teaching, which I think is a good one, when we are not desperate? The answer to me is very clear. The time to practice Mussar is when you're not desperate. If you, and this is really what Mussar is about, and it's really what I open the door to all of you to really recognize and grab hold of, is that Mussar provides methodologies to cultivate inner traits when you don't need them, so that you will have them when you do. Somebody once asked me a question about something that was going on in life. She said, do you have any tricks? I said, no, I don't have any tricks. There are no tricks in the Mussar techniques. But one can cultivate that sense of bitachon in times of calmness and kind of general peace, so that in the moment when you really are in a situation of test, you have those to call on. I mean, I had an episode of that this summer when I had a terrible abdominal pain, so much so that my wife called 911, And, you know, as I said, I'm almost 68 years old. I've never called 911. That never happened before. And I got, you know, taken out of the house and carried on a stretcher into an ambulance, down to the clinic. And what came into my mind was all the preparation I had done for situations like this that I'd never been in before. So my inner work in a time of not needing it was there for me as tools in a situation of difficulty and stress. And it gave me things to work with, so I didn't go somewhere completely that I wouldn't have wanted to go to in those situations. So I would say, if a person finds themselves in a desperate situation, they're just going to have to cope with desperation. Because once you become desperate, what I'm talking about is, how do you not become desperate? How do you equip yourself with tools so that you have what you need in the face of a real challenging situation? You know, there are times when it's just going to be terrible. And what I'm talking about is the Mussar teachings that give us the tools so that there are fewer of those. And we have more tools to deal with the kinds of challenges we do come up with, and that we are then fortunate to have prepared ourselves for. All right, more to say about everything, but let's leave it at that for now. As I said, I wish you Gemar Chatima Tova, a complete sealing, in the sense of a stamp, a sealing in the book of life for a good year ahead. Thank you for attending this evening.
Good night, everybody. Thank you, Alan.
Okay, thanks, Jeff.
All right. Thank you.